gap, when I talk about the gap that exists in Canada, I'm referring to the socioeconomic gap that exists between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples here in this great country called Canada. Canada is a very rich country. And even according to the United Nations Human Development Index, it's rated 6th in terms of quality of life. You apply those same indices to Indigenous peoples, we're 63rd. That's the gap I'm talking about. And the gap that exists in terms of education, there's a huge fiscal gap that exists in terms of quality of education. The housing gap that exists, there's huge gaps in terms of quality of life, in terms of youth suicides, high incarceration rates, access to potable water, the healthcare indicators, everything, there's a huge gap. And in a rich country like Canada, that's just not acceptable. And so we've got to really work with governments, both federal and provincial, to devise strategies to close the gap. Start making key investments now in education and training. Start making key investments now in adequate infrastructure, adequate housing, access to potable water. Developing youth strategies nationally so there's not that high epidemic of youth suicides across this land. We've got to do that now. We have the fastest growing segment of Canada's population is young First Nations men and women. And it's a huge capital labor pool that should be accessed and should be invested in. Invest in human capital. That's closing the gap. And we need to do that sooner than later. That's what I mean when I talk about the gap. And in Canada, it's just not acceptable. And when you close the gap, that's not only good for First Nations people, that's good for provincial economies, that's good for the Canadian economy. And that's what's going to really change this country and transform it into an example throughout the world on how it deals with Indigenous peoples. There's respect, there's peaceful coexistence and mutual respect when that gap starts to close. And that's an investment for the future.